Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, students and scholars, teachers and trainers, professors and professionals, those who are listening from the field of science, religion, arts, commerce and engineering, students, those who are preparing themselves for appearing in that SLAT examination. I, Dr. Rakesh from USA, heartily, cordially welcome all of you. It is really nice time, nice place, nice section. You are listening. The present is 1930 to 1955. What is the present age in English literature? It is between 1930 to 1955. The old legacies and new tendencies. The division of literature into periods convenient for study may create an impression that the written in each age can be treated independently of their predecessors and successors. That view should be discouraged. We are the heirs of all our ancestors. Our parents will be the heirs of our forerunners and of ourselves. Whatever seems new in literature is found on examination to have roots stretching back into a more or less remote past. However fresh the shoots or strange the blossoms, their nourishment has come from the soil and the air, which gave life to things that may now seem finished and done with. What it may be asked, have we of the atomic age to do with the classic age in Greece of nearly 2500 years ago, or even with the Victorian age in England of only 100 years ago? Answers can be found in the literature of our own time. For the apparently most advanced writers in the present age have been deeply indebted to both those periods as well as to periods in between. James Joyce's Ulysses inform the most revolutionary novel of the 20th century is designed upon the plan of Homer's Odyssey. T.S. Eliot's poetry as his notes to the wasteland shore draws from many past sources. English and foreign, while no influence is stronger in the work of Eliot's younger contemporaries than that of the Victorian poet Gerald Manley Hopkins. Indeed, without Hopkins, who was almost entirely unknown during his own lifetime, present day poetry would be very different from what it is. But of course, no good writer depends wholly or even mainly on the past. Present experience in his personal life and in the wider social and political he lives in is no less important, and it influences his work deeply if the times are troubled. When Thomas Hardy died in 1928, the world appeared to be recovering from the consequences of the past World War. Though the recovery had been slow and painful, and long-sighted people were still uneasy about the outlook. The the League of Nations had failed to bring about the state of international harmony hoped for by its founders, and poverty and social unrest persisted in many places. Then, as the 1990s and individual persons in Britain, millions of unemployed created problem, and hitherto flourishing industrial regions became distressed. An account of the state of the country at that time can be found in J.B. Priestley's An English Journey, 1934. In Germany, the burden of unemployment created the conditions that Hitler exploited as a stepping stone to autocratic power, which he used to When Thomas Hardy died in 1928, the world appeared to be recovering from the consequences of the First World War, though the recovery had been slow and painful, and long-sighted people were still uneasy about the outlook. The League of Nations had failed to bring about the state of international harmony hoped for by its founders, and poverty and social unrest persisted in many places. Then, as the 1930s approached, a whole worldwide financial crisis struck both rich and poor, threatening ruin to whole nations as well as bringing misery and want to unnumbered families and individual persons. In Britain, millions of unemployed created a grave social problem, and hitherto flourishing industrial regions became distressed areas. An account of the state of the country at that time can be found in J.B. Priestley's An English Journey, 1934. In Germany, the burden of unemployment created the conditions that Hitler exploited as a stepping stone to autocratic power, which he used to rearm the nation and thus re-employ the multitudes of workless in furious preparations for military supremacy. The god of war, overthrown in 1918, was mounting his throne again, not only in Germany but also in Japan, whose militarists made war in China, in Italy, where Mussolini dreamed of a modern Roman Empire and prepared for conquest in Abyssinia and Libya, and in Spain, where a civil war raged with terrifying savagery. In these circumstances, many writers became convinced that literature was useless if it did not serve a definite social and political purpose, and those who failed to share this returns, therefore, to the serious mood which had dominated the mid-Victorian period. But with a difference, the Victorian had been mainly preoccupied with the condition of England question, the problem of how to uplift the poor. And their literature was permeated by a spirit of non-violent humanitarianism. The writings of the 1930s, however, were as much preoccupied with the condition of the whole world. For air travel had made the world appear as small a place as Britain a century before, and humanitarian hopefulness had been displaced by partisan propaganda, which by implication, if not explicitly, offered some particular political doctrine as a means to world salvation. The case for literature with a purpose is obvious. The case against it is less so. Literature is more than pamphleteering. Otherwise, many thousands of pamphlets now forgotten would still be read as much as novels and poetry are read. Literature is not the mere statement of a problem, however important, nor simply the pleading of a cause, however worthy. Literature is a creative art written by creative literary artists. The motive power of artists is imagination, which endows them with vision, and the perception of truth is its full aspect. A vision of truth is the peculiar and special contribution which a great poet or a great novelist is qualified to give it to mankind. It is a vision of the beauty and perfection that is humanity's ideal aim, the end toward which all things move, but they move with agonizing slowness, painful step by painful step. And it is with this almost imperceptible progress that politicians and sociologists are concerned. Politics, it has been said, is the art of the possible. In contrast, it can be said that poetry is the art of the desirable. When a poet attempts to harness his talent to current practical problems, he is more likely to cripple his own imagination than to serve mankind, for a poet very rarely allows importance to significant facts while he commands a vision of ultimate truth. If he loses that vision through a misapplied concern with the facts, he sacrifices his bright right and betrays his mission. He becomes modifying lines used by George M. Meredith in another connection of modern love. A rapid falcon condemned to do the bleating of a bat. Such is the end to which poets have come when they have been unwisely possessed by a conviction that literature is unworthy if it does not develop a social conscience in relation to immediate affairs. Much literature in the 1930s was conscience ridden in that way, and the writers and works of the period, when shifted by posterity, will in all probability be valued in proportion to the degree in which they look beyond the disturbances of their own period. From his ivory tower, the poet or novelist may see more and speak more, saving wisdom, than if he descends to bustle about in the political cockpit. Gerald Manley Hopkins. G.M. Hopkins, there is no parallel in literary history to the case of G.M. Hopkins 1844 to 89, who published nothing in his own lifetime. Yet after his collected poems were first issued in 1980s, had so deep and wide an influence upon the younger generation that the aspect of modern poetry was changed right up to the present time, and his influence is still unadjusted. Hopkins went from Highgate School to Balliol College, Oxford, where he became a follower of the Anglican High Church party until in 1866 he turned Roman Catholic and 2 years later joined the Society of Jesus. As a devout Jesuit, he considered it his religious duty to discontinue writing poetry. But when a shipwreck in December 1875 caused the drowning of 5 Franciscan nuns, he was inspired by compose his outstanding poem, The Wreck of the Disused Land. Besides being deeply religious, Hopkins was a profound scholar. He served as professor of Greek at Dublin University from 1884 with an exceptionally austere, subtle and complex mind. Though he loved the beauties of nature, glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of purple color, fishes' wings, landscape plotted and piced. He wrote in pie beauty. Hopkins turned away from the romantic style of poetry, which had been practiced throughout the 19th century and continued in vogue until the closing stages of the First World War. He adopted metrical forms and a verse technique which owed something to John Donne and other metaphysical poets of the 17th century, but he was far more an innovator than a borrower. To describe his own system of prosody, he used the term sprung rhythm and the word inscape to denote his aim in the treatment of subject material. Neither of these expressions can be defined apart from a close study of the poems and of the letters in which he wrote about them to his friends, one of the chief of whom, Robert Breeze, edited the 1980s volume. Though he was not in particular sympathy with Hopkins' methods and convictions, the Hopkins Reader, compiled by John Pick in 1953, contains a liberal selection of poems and letters and provides the most useful and illuminating introduction to a difficult writer who is regarded by his admirers and disciples as one of the greatest English poets. Since it is strange that a poet who died in 1889 should be included in a chapter dealing with a much later period. Attention must be given briefly to the reasons why Hopkins has appeared to our contemporaries, both religious and non-religious, as closely akin to themselves. It is impossible to know what effect his work would have had if he had published it while he was alive, but it is at least probable that it would have made little impression, for the spirit of Victorian times was mostly at variance with his own, and the climate of opinion was not favorable to intellectual complexity and such spiritual probing. Although there had been little wars, although there was still much poetry, the educated classes had enjoyed the long periods of peace and prosperity. For them, life was simple and comfortable. All that was changed by the coming of war in 1914. The firm, safe bottom of the world dropped out. Life suddenly ceased to be either simple or comfortable, while the older generation still clung hopefully to their memories of a stable world. Younger people were more concise, more conscious of a troubled present and a perplexing future. In literature, the smooth romantic writings which had satisfied their presence and had until 1940s pleased, them, pleased themselves now appeared superficial and empty. The polished surface of life was shattered and they looked down into a dark abyss which, however frightening, it was their stern task to explore. Religion had been a main source of comfort to their elders, but a religion requiring hardly more than a quiet round of Christian and craggy, no longer like a pastoral landscape, but rather a prospect of granite mountains and chasms. It was into this prospect that Gerard Manley Hopkins' poems were throws were thrown, and before long they were recognized as the work of a spiritual explorer whose vision had penetrated below life's surfaces and whose poetic craft was appropriate to the needs of the new generation. Here was a kind of poetry which did not act as a smoothing plane gliding over a surface of appearances, but as a rope drill driving down into realities. And realities were the aim of religious and irreligious alike. Hopkins, it seemed, had found and passed to them a poetic instrument which they could employ for their own purposes, whether or not their particular purpose were like his own. But while it is simple to take an instrument in hand, it is less simple to use it effectively, because they were tired of easy poetry and had responded to Hopkins' poetry because it was not easy. A good many of his followers neglected to observe that there is no virtue in difficulty as an end in itself. However difficult Hopkins may at times be, he is always saying something worth saying, something which it is worth the readers while to labor to comprehend. The far-reaching influence of Hopkins after 1980s was not altogether fortunate for English poetry, since it encouraged lesser minds than his so forced the illusion that clarity is inferior to obscurity, and that obscurity and profundity go hand in hand. The truth is, of course, that a good poet, however difficult, is never obscure. If by obscurity we mean that what he is saying cannot be comprehended by those who learn his language. Milton is obscure until we master the Miltonic language. Browning is obscure until the master the Browning language. On the other hand, many of Hopkins' imitators are obscure because they have no language of their own, no personal poetic technique, and nothing to say that could not be said in plain prose, when its lack of true content would be immediately evident. For the very reason that his influence has been so great, it is Highly important to distinguish between those poets whose work is genuinely illuminated by his examples and those others who have merely embraced the Hawkins cult and been led by it into a blind alley. T.S. Eliot and others in literary cult is deplorable in as much as it may lead other writers into unintelligent imitation and a mass of readers into unintelligent adulation. It destroys the faculty of independent creation and the faculty of independent critical judgment. It is difficult to separate the Hawkins cult from the T.S. Eliot's cult. They have run concurrently and there are close resemblances in the writings of these two poets. Eliot must not be regarded, however, simply as a disciple of Hawkins, though he has no more escaped the Hawkins influence than any other writers in the present age. He published his first poems, True Flow and other observations 1917 before Hawkins appeared, and all his work is strongly individual and creative personal. He was born in the United States in 1888 and was educated there and in France before settling down in England and at length adopting British citizenship. With the Wasteland 1922, he established the reputation which made him the leading living poet of the English-speaking world. Though his output for some years was extremely small, consisting of little more in verse than two short pieces, The Journey of the Maggie and Ash Wednesday. But during those years, he wrote a number of critical works in prose, which created as marked an impression in the study of Dante, Milton, and other writers of the past, as his poetry was making in its own field. The Wasteland presented a disturbing vision of the state of the contemporary world in free verse, interspersed with the variety of literary allusions and quotations, and arising to a prophetic tone in which there appeared to be no sound of Christian hope. It was a Jeremiah-like vision of human society as Eliot saw it after the war, confused, dirty, barren in spirit, and altogether horrible. The imagery was deliberately unromantic, in places deliberately ugly, and drawn be shocking in serious way. Its purpose was to shock its readers into seeing their wasteland as it was, a spiritually dry and materially littered place. For some years the poem was very little understood, and it was much disliked by those who had been brought up on romantic. Dear friends, those who are listening, watching English literature, basically they will find it more convenient while preparing themselves with the words of the language to literature. May God bless all of you. Thank you. Thank you.